the 15 Native American Marvel characters singled out for Indian Country Today's 2018 list of notables, 6 were debuted by Claremont, all in X titles. At the time Claremont began his X-Men run, the only superheroes from this list in existence were Thunderbird, who Claremont sort of killed, and Red Wolf, who goes back to the 1970s. Of those featured on this list, Claremont launched Forge, Moonstar, Warpath, Silver Fox, Scalp Hunter, and Shaman. Representation matters, we know that. But presence, in contrast to absence, is just the first step. And where Claremont sets something of a gold standard in terms of just creating Indigenous representation in comics, how he represents these characters is the next step. And while he succeeds in prominent ways, there are other ways in which he falters. We should start by noting that comics have an extensive history of representing Indigenous people as primitive villain characters, sometimes to truly grotesque proportions. This comes in from a lot of different sources, but I would single out the popularity of comics westerns, as well as the portrayal of Indigenous savagery that we find in highly influential comics artists such as Frank Frazetta. Claremont doesn't fall into this trap. His Indigenous characters are sympathetic and intelligent, even those occupying a place called the Savage Land. Where Claremont does falter a bit, however, is in what's called the trope of the magic Native American. The website TV Tropes defines it as such, quote, Native Americans, or a race meant to be an XP of them, who possess powers because of their ethnicity. Often this involves stating that their power comes from innate spirituality or closeness to nature that civilized races don't have. Usually involves influence over nature, animals, or other spirit powers, end quote. Comics have a history here, a consistent pattern of using this trope as everything from a plot point to an actual superpower. Here, Claremont struggles, with most of his Indigenous characters effectively becoming the magic Native American. This is especially problematic for Forge, whose technomancy powers often take a back seat to some shaman-like abilities that he draws upon to resolve conflicts instead. This is a problem, in the sense that Forge is operating way outside of type beforehand. He's introduced to X-Men as a Tony Stark-like character, a wealthy industrial playboy genius with some emotional constipation and a surfacing call to heroism. This is not the typical role afforded to Indigenous peoples in comics, and stands as a refreshing counterpoint to certain entrenched industry perceptions of Indigenous peoples. For this reason, Forge donning a loincloth and summoning spirits is a bit of a letdown, though we might argue that Claremont was trying to surface Forge's heritage in order to avoid that aspect of his identity being glossed over. Charitable reading. Forge achieves a number of noteworthy touchstones. He's disabled, a Vietnam War vet, the first Indigenous leader of the X-Men, even though his team is remarkably small for most of that time. And even more importantly, he's the first character to be worthy of canonically dating Storm, Claremont's most prized creation. This is all to say that despite the conformity to the trope, there's a lot to admire in Forge's portrayal. Over on the New Mutants, an X-Men spinoff, Danielle Moonstar is a team leader herself, another viewpoint character, like Forge, and a beloved fan favorite. Her heritage becomes an important part of the most famous New Mutants story, the Demon Bear Saga, which falls again into the magic Native American trope. Interestingly, a later story in the New Mutants has Dani become a member of the mythical Norse Valkyrie, creating an intriguing intersection of Norse and Cheyenne mythology, one that serves to defamiliarize both, thus breaking down racial barriers in a compelling way. Also with the Pegasus. It's always difficult to talk about representation in comics, to try to parse through the progressive versus regressive elements, especially when these distinctions can be so incredibly variable and subjective. Discussing Claremont's contribution to representation of Indigenous peoples is challenging, downright awkward even. This is the writer who cultivated Forge and Dani, and James and Michael, but also the writer who had a cop and a nurse race swap into Indigenous bodies at the end of the Demon Bear Saga, and who had Gateway exist in ways that could only be supernatural. For me, a very white man raising 2 Métis children with my Métis partner, I like to come back to the importance of the first step, and the value of having representations of Indigenous peoples at all to criticize. Claremont's Indigenous characters often fell into the magical Native American trope, but these heroes were all given a great deal of narrative agency and development, a great deal of love and consideration, in my humble opinion, thus establishing an Indigenous presence in mainstream comics, and we'd be foolish to fail to recognize that as the accomplishment that it is. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the Claremont Run, you can follow us on Twitter at Claremont Run, or you can find our website at www.claremontrun.com.